They are a they are a writer and mental health therapist raised in a secular Russian Jewish immigrant family. They turned to ritual as a way to cope when they were diagnosed with breast cancer in 2017. Miri is passionate about crafting, being outdoors, sharing knowledge with others, and caring for their plants and cats. And I think we are all ready. Take us off.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I am going to share my screen with you so you can see my slideshow in just one moment. Cool. Thumbs up if you can see it.
Yes.
Thumbs up.
So I'll jump right in. On October 30th, 2017, at age 26, I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. It was one of those things that happened, as they say, slowly and then all at once. The tumor must have been growing for a while by the time I noticed it during a self-exam and made an appointment with my doctor. One day I was texting back the cute girl I'd met at a show that weekend, and the next I was filing for FMLA at work and obsessively Googling invasive ductal carcinoma. Up until that point in my life, my relationship with the concept of ritual was friendly but distant. As Ben mentioned, I was raised in a secular Jewish family. I took part in Jewish communal life from time to time, as many Jewish atheists do. I enjoyed the random bursts of oxytocin you get when you sing in groups, but otherwise, I wondered what the relevance of all this was in our modern lives. As a psychotherapist with a decent knowledge of neuroscience, I understood what ritual can do for our brains, but I didn't get it on any sort of personal level. That, along with a great many other things, changed pretty quick. During my treatment, I started to find a use for ritual. At the very beginning, I cut my hair short and dyed it purple, a small ritual to feel more powerful and in control. Eventually, my hair fell out, and every morning I covered my head before allowing anyone besides my partners or family to see me, another small ritual that ironically closely parallels one that people of various faiths perform each day. But towards the end of chemo, I discovered that shedding my wigs and hair scarves had a special power in it too. I'd come home from a symphony concert one night, dressed and made up, and as I took off my wig, I found that I looked every bit the Space Empress, and that's when I posted this photo that you see here. With chemo over and my tumor apparently gone, there was one last hurdle left to clear, and this one was the most terrifying of them all. After my diagnosis, I'd undergone genetic testing and discovered that I carried the BRCA1 genetic mutation. I won't bore you with the medical details, but essentially that means that without a double mastectomy, I'd almost certainly be condemning myself to a lifetime of cancer recurrences and new breast cancers and potentially worse. So it was a pretty easy decision to go for the double mastectomy as soon as I was done with chemo. That being said, it was an easy decision when it comes to the risk factors involved. It was certainly not easy emotionally, not just because, I don't know, if you have boobs and you want to have boobs, losing them kind of sucks, but also surgery was and still is probably my greatest fear short of dying or losing someone I love. I was mortally terrified of it on a phobic sort of level. I was very fortunate to have had a pretty healthy and accident-free life. I'd never had surgery. I'd never gone under general anesthesia. I hadn't even really been to a hospital up until I, started to get chemo. And as the weeks passed and the surgery date approached, I was panicking in ways that I'd never had before. I had a therapist, I had my own training, I had so much support from people that I'm so grateful for, but nothing was really clicking until one day I decided that I would mark this transition with a ritual. And so what I did was I got together with the rabbi from the synagogue I would attend from time to time, and we designed a ritual to essentially mark this transition from the self that I was to the self that I would become. Not just losing breasts and getting reconstruction or whatever, but undergoing the thing that I basically feared the most. So we designed this ritual using certain Jewish traditions, pulling from my own family background and my personal interests. I invited friends to do it with me, and a week before my surgery, we did it. And it was one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. It was extremely meaningful to the people who attended. We wrote letters, we shared things. People told me years after that that day had an impact on them. And I realized that without this ritual, I mean, okay, the title of this talk is a little bit of an exaggeration. I'm sure y'all know that. Really, it was chemo and science that saved my life and all that fun stuff. But I do feel that it saved some part of me emotionally, or dare I even say spiritually. It allowed me to approach one of my greatest fears with, I won't say with calmness because that would be a tall order, but with something approaching it. So that's why I decided to start talking to people about how ritual, including secular ritual, can be impactful, not just if you're facing something as devastating as I was, but really just about for anything. So why do people have ritual? Obviously, a chief reason for it is to find purpose and meaning in life. Even if you're a religious person and you kind of have some of that purpose and meaning supplied by your religious teachings, people still tend to need to feel that the things that are happening to them on a day-to-day basis are happening for some sort of reason, or if not for any sort of cosmic reason, right? At least for a reason.
While you watch this, companies will make 720.
For instance, for me, this mastectomy that I had to have became a way to confront my fears, to learn how to really advocate for myself, and to learn to be comfortable, or more comfortable, I should say, asking for and receiving support. So that brings me to the second reason. Ritual can help build community. When people do things together for a reason, especially when those things involve some sort of intimacy, some sort of sharing, some sort of connection, it can build community. And I think it's been said by a lot of people more well-spoken than me that one of the challenges in building secular and atheist community is that we can't lean on the sort of rituals and traditions that religious communities have. And while that certainly does not mean that we should or need to start praying, I think that there are certain things that we can take from their example. So the next reason is support. So for me, my main reason for doing my mastectomy ritual was to get support for the fear I was facing, for the massive change I was about to undergo. And I found it through inviting people to take part in the ritual with me. Obviously, I could have always reached out to people individually and been like, hey, could you write me a little letter on a piece of paper that I can take with me to the hospital, right? And maybe people would have done it, maybe they wouldn't have. But in creating a ritual space where that was actually one of the activities that we did, it allowed me to receive that support and to carry it with me. And so lastly, mindfulness and intentionality are great reasons to try to get into ritual and incorporate it into your life. These are entirely secular concepts, and as I often tell my clients in sessions, intention is the secret sauce. It's what changes random actions that we do, kind of bouncing around from day to day and letting life take us where it will, into something resembling meaning or power or agency. When we take a moment to really decide what we're going to do and why, and do that thing and pay attention to how that thing feels and how it affects us, it can create a more meaningful life, a more mentally healthy life, a more physically healthy life even. I could give a whole other talk on how so many health issues that are so prevalent in the United States often come about through people not learning how to check in with their bodies and know what's going on with them until things become extreme. For instance, people who exercise badly or do heavy labor and don't realize until their 40s, 50s, 60s that they've done a lot of damage to their backs, to their hips, to their necks. Obviously, that's not even talking about the constraints of capitalism that force people to work their bodies, but that is also a whole other talk. So there's been a lot of fascinating research on ritual. In an article for Scientific American, Francesca Gino and Michael Norton wrote this. Recent research suggests that rituals may be more rational than they appear. Why? Because even simple rituals can be extremely effective. Rituals performed after experiencing losses, from loved ones to lotteries, do alleviate grief, and rituals performed before high-pressure tasks like singing in public do in fact reduce anxiety and increase people's confidence. What's more, rituals appear to benefit even people who claim not to believe that rituals work. This is fascinating and makes me think that ritual is basically a self-created version of the placebo effect. So we know that the placebo effect can work even when people do not expect the medication or the treatment they're doing to actually help them. And it's thought nowadays, there's a really interesting podcast that I'll try to have Ben send out to you guys. It's thought nowadays that the reason that happens is because when we go to a doctor or whatever healing practitioner we go to, and we feel really listened to by that person, and they prescribe us something to do, right? Whether it's some totally wooey alt med stuff, or it's a surgery, a medication that you take, all of that is ritual. And when we feel listened to and believed by this person who now tells us to go and do that thing, it actually seems to, I'm going to sound super wooey when I say this, but I swear it's the research. It actually seems to unlock some of our body's like inherent potential for healing, which is super cool. And also really sad, because if you think about the experiences that a lot of us have in medical settings, being listened to and understood aren't necessarily that common of an experience, unfortunately. But ritual seems to do a lot of good things for our bodies, mentally and physically. So some more examples of how ritual can help. Obviously, it can help in coping with grief. There's a reason why human societies throughout history have had funeral rituals. It can help with handling more mundane disappointments. The research that they were talking about in the Scientific American article talked about rituals for getting rejected for a job, playing the lottery and losing, things like that. It can help improve self-confidence before a challenging task. It can reduce anxiety about a stressful or dangerous situation. And with these last two, you see a lot, for instance, like in the world of sports, athletes tend to be a superstitious bunch. They have certain rituals that they do before a game, before a competition. A lot of that has to do with improving their confidence and reducing their anxiety, which we know tend to improve performance, whatever it is that you're doing. So some more examples from my own experience. So as I mentioned, my ritual before my mastectomy helped me reduce anxiety and kind of increase my feelings of acceptance about the situation. It also came in very useful in my life afterwards, because what happened after I finished all of my cancer-related surgeries is that my mom got cancer also, which was a really just, that's all I can say about that series of coincidences. But that sucked. And given that I was done with my own treatment, back to work full time, caring for other humans with their own often very traumatic problems, I was struggling to cope. And one day I went downstairs to our pharmacy at work, where we sell a variety of things, including stuffed animals. And I was looking through it and I was like, okay, I'm way too old on some level, right, to need a stuffy, but maybe it'll help. And I found a stuffed kangaroo with the little baby Joey in its pocket. And I just on a whim bought it. And I left it on my desk at work for the rest of my mom's treatment. And every morning when I came into work, I would kind of hug it to my chest and hold it and just kind of have a moment of mindfulness. And at the end of every day, I would hug it again and I would kind of mentally thank it. And it would sit there on my desk, and it almost served as like a kind of a container for the feelings of fear and re-traumatization and grief and everything else that I was holding, to allow me to be more present with my clients and do my work. And I remember too, the day that I took it off the desk and took it home, when my mom's scans came back clear. And it was truly a magical moment. And so finally, rituals in my life haven't just been about coping with really, really scary stuff. I also, that same spring, I built my first raised bed garden. And I decided to at the end of that, to have a kind of a little dedication ceremony. I modeled it after the ancient Roman festival of Floralia, where it was customary to celebrate kind of flowers and planting and, you know, bring about a prosperous season. It was customary to pelt each other with dry beans, and also to be naked. So I didn't quite take those aspects of the tradition. We instead pelted each other with water guns and used them to water the garden also. No nudity, not that kind of scene, but it was a happy moment, and I remember it to this day. And every time I look outside at my garden, which is right over there, I remember that moment that I shared with friends celebrating my hard work. So, what makes up a ritual? So, most rituals follow a specific structure. They utilize some sort of symbols. They involve purposeful movements or actions, right? Things that we kind of decide ahead of time we're going to do. And they tend to include speaking, chanting, or singing of some sort. So a French ethnographer named Arnold van Gennep studied rites of passage in the early 20th century. He traveled around, studied different cultures, and asked them what their rites of passage are. And he identified 3 stages that seem to show up in all of these rituals. The first stage is separation. The second, he called liminality or transition. And then the final stage was incorporation. So obviously not all rituals can be considered rites of passage. For instance, my breast cancer ritual definitely was a rite of passage, but the little kangaroo ritual I had when my mom was sick wasn't really. So that being said, this is a good framework to think about if you want to understand how you can incorporate ritual into your own life, because these are totally secular concepts. So in the separation portion of a ritual, the individual or individuals who are participating are separated from each other or from the rest of the community in some way. So if you look at a lot of the common rituals that we have in our society, both secular and otherwise, you'll see this example. So for instance, traditionally for many people, a couple about to get married spends the night separately, the night before their wedding, or they don't see each other, right, dressed up until the actual moment, or they just walk separately down the aisle. If you've ever been to any sort of high school or college graduation, graduating students, right, are separated from their families, they sit separately. And from my own culture, before a young Jewish person undergoes a bar bat mitzvah, they study privately or with the rabbi, kind of apart from their families, and they're kind of taken out of their usual routine to engage in this religious study and preparation. So the next stage is transition. So at this point, the person or the group of people who are taking part in the ritual undergo some sort of change or transformation. So for example, at a wedding, the couple recites vows or exchanges rings. At a graduation, the graduating students receive a diploma and they move their tassels from right to left. And for the Jewish Bnei Mitzvah ritual, the person going through the ritual, they read from the Torah and they give a Dvar Torah, basically like a little sermon during the ritual. And so finally, we have incorporation. So at this point, the person or the people undergoing the ritual are reincorporated back into the larger group or community. So the newlywed couple walks back down the aisle together and celebrates with their guests. The graduating students return to their families and attend graduation parties. And the young Jewish person who's gone through their bar bat mitzvah is now considered an adult and participates fully in synagogue services. So they're kind of reincorporated. So as I mentioned, symbols are pretty commonly used in ritual. A symbol is an object or action that signifies something else, tangible or intangible. So for example, many of you probably have wedding rings. Those represent the bond of marriage. For me, my stuffed kangaroo represented my relationship with my mom, and my sorrow and fear about her illness was kind of a vessel into which I put all of that. Symbols are useful for a number of reasons. They can refer to things that are difficult or impossible to convey using words. For example, your marriage vows are unique to you and your spouse, if you have one, and that's like a lot, but when you look at your wedding ring, right, you can kind of recall those vows. And that's why, throughout history, it has been very significant if someone, for instance, removes their wedding ring or gives it back or even loses it or whatever. So another use of symbolism is to elicit desired emotions. So when I would see the kangaroo on my desk at work, I would feel love for my mom. I would feel my grief and fear about her illness. And obviously you might ask, well, why would I want to feel those things? Well, because I'm going to be feeling them anyway. And if I can see the kangaroo and kind of have a moment where I acknowledge to myself, like, wow, I'm really scared that my mom is going to die, then I'm able to have that feeling and have that moment and sit with it before I have to kind of put it away and go to work. Symbols can also support self-expression. Like, it can be fun, it can be cool. If you've ever planned any sort of like wedding, big party, whatever, it might have been fun for you to like incorporate things that represented you or your partner, whatever achievement that you had. For instance, people often, for graduation ceremonies, they write things or do something personalized with their graduation cap. So they're taking a symbol, right, but they are adding something personal into it. And so finally, this is really interesting. Symbols actually help us when it comes to learning and memory. There's a lot of complicated kind of neurological reasons for that, but one of them is that because they contain like a lot of things all in one, if you associate that symbol with that set of actions, ideas, feelings that you want to cultivate, thoughts that you want to remember, if you can see that object and recall all of those things, it's a lot easier for your memory to do that. So next element of ritual that we've got is embodied action. So this is basically any sort of intentional physical thing that you do, like with your body, for a specific purpose. So in Judaism, there's a lot of ritual hand washing, also a lot of ritual candle lighting. In Catholicism, receiving the sacrament is an example. At graduation, right, throwing the caps. There's no rational reason to do that. In fact, it's kind of irrational when you have to go and find them later. But it's an embodied action. It means something. And of course, for the wedding ceremony example, exchanging rings is also an embodied action, right? Like, you don't have to do that, right? Like, you could have just had a ring in your pocket and put it on. But instead, we do the ring exchange. It means something. Embodied action also plays a role in learning and memory. When we do something physically in association with, like, again, a concept or idea or a memory that we want to preserve, it's more likely to stay in our memory. And that's why most, if not all, rituals include this component somehow. And so words are almost always part of a ritual in some way. This is what really brings it together. This is what gives the meaning to the symbols, gives the meaning to the embodied actions, whatever it is that you're doing. So examples of this can include secular prayer, which is a thing, setting intentions, naming the symbols or practices as you're doing them, singing, of course, and just sharing your thoughts and feelings. So if, having heard all this, you are curious about creating a ritual to mark your own occasion of some sort, I've got some suggestions for you. So some questions that would be good to ask yourself: what are you hoping to observe, honor, or mark with this ritual, right? Like, what is the purpose? Because that's really going to guide how you design it. What emotional notes do you want your ritual to hit? Do you want it to be celebratory, joyful? Is it a ritual of grief? Is it a ritual of courage? Is it about confronting fear? Is it about feeling appropriate guilt and atoning for it? Finally, what personal transition would you like to facilitate with this ritual? So obviously, if you're planning, for instance, a wedding, you're hoping to transition to being married. If you're planning a graduation party, you're transitioning to being the proud bearer of whatever, hopefully not too expensive diploma you've got. But it can be something much more subtle. It can be transitioning to letting go of a toxic relationship that you ended, a ritual for quitting a job, starting a new job, cultivating some sort of personal trait that you would like to cultivate. Can be just about anything. So you might choose to incorporate some sort of pre-existing traditions into your ritual. And traditions can come from a lot of different sources, right? It can come from your family. If there's been things in your family that, even if they weren't done as traditions, for instance, I don't know, say you really enjoyed going out for ice cream with your family and it gives you that sense of childhood nostalgia. If you're doing a ritual that has to do with childhood nostalgia, you might incorporate ice cream. I think ice cream is a great thing to incorporate. So your particular culture or subculture can also be a source of tradition. And when I say culture, I don't just mean like what part of the country or the world you're from. I also mean subcultures like atheism, secularism, LGBTQ subcultures, anything, nerdy subcultures. We've got our rituals. Traditions can come from the media. They can also come from history if you research them. You can also reconstruct or remix traditions in whatever way you would like. For instance, my mom is calling me, speaking of things. For instance, for my mastectomy ritual, I took a lot of Jewish traditions and I kind of made them more relevant and kind of secularized them a little bit. So you can also create or use symbols for your ritual. You can find inspiration in art and literature, certainly. For instance, traditionally, right, like red roses have symbolized love, but you can also look to your own emotional responses to things, right? Like if red roses to you feel angry and you're doing a ritual to let go of or perhaps cultivate anger, you could use red roses. You can also look to your own personal histories or inside jokes that you have with people in your life. You can find a ritual pretty much anywhere, but there's three things that make symbols particularly effective. One is simplicity. You want the symbol to be, if it's a visual representation, something that's pretty, clear and simple, like a rose, like a ring. You want it to be specific, right? So rather than just having a red rose stand for love, you might have it stand for romantic love. You might have it stand for the love between you and your partner or your partners. Or it could be something else. It could be the love between you and your mom, love between you and your friend, whatever you want it to be. And finally, similarity. So you want the symbol to feel similar to the thing that it's representing in some way. For instance, for wedding rings, I've often read that the fact that it's a circle kind of represents unity, represents eternity even, and those are feelings that people kind of want to cultivate when they think about weddings or marriage. So obviously, an important concern here is cultural appropriation. So it is really, really common for people to, I should say for white people, to take rituals, symbols, whatever, from other cultures and appropriate them. And this is really complicated, right? It's easy to say, like, if you're doing something in the privacy of your own home, like, what does it really matter? But I think it matters because we're taking things that other people have been marginalized for doing or using and taking them for ourselves. So some good questions to ask yourself here are, where are you drawing your traditions and symbols from? And what is the context? Something that I hear a lot from white folks when I talk about this is like, well, I don't have a culture. Like we don't have symbols, we don't have rituals. That's not strictly speaking true. It is the case that, especially in the United States, like a lot of the, people like to talk about the melting pot. A lot of the cultures that American-born folks have come from have kind of been diluted and subsumed into this bowl of Americanness, I guess. But chances are you and your family come from somewhere. And also, a tradition that comes from Ohio is still a tradition. Ohio, because I'm here, I guess. So you can ask yourself, what is your own heritage and what were your ancestors' practices? It can be recent, it can be a long time ago. Some examples of kind of sources of traditions for mostly white folks can be tarot, comes from Italy. There's a lot of folklore from Europe, ancient festivals like the Floralia Festival from ancient Rome, traditional foods, right? A lot of the foods that folks eat at Christmas or even at Thanksgiving, they come from recipes that have been passed down over the years among British, German, Dutch, French, Italian, American families. So there's definitely places to look. I think that this is something to do a lot of kind of self-reflection on so that we don't perpetuate harmful racist stuff. So the last thing to consider if you want to create a ritual is potentially getting other people involved in it. So some questions to think about here: should you include other people? How will you explain your ritual to the people who are participating? Will they take on particular roles or just observe? How will you make sure that everyone's kind of on board and like consenting for what's going on? Because ritual can be a pretty powerful psychological experience, and a lot of us have certain traumas or hangups or bad experiences with anything that smacks of religion. So if you're doing this and you want to invite other secular folks, that's something to be mindful of. And the last thing to think about is like, what about people who don't believe in this? Are they going to be involved? Are you going to try to like sell it to them, or are you going to just, let them do what they're going to do? So there's benefits both of doing a solitary ritual and of doing it in a social setting. So with a solitary ritual, of course, you have privacy. It's easier to, schedule it, find the time to do it. And you don't have to deal about any sort of judgment, misunderstanding, making others uncomfortable, any of that. It's kind of nice sometimes to just do something kind of silly and not feel like you have to justify it, But social rituals have their own purposes too. If the point of your ritual is to seek some sort of like emotional support from people, obviously that's a good reason to do it with other people. People can help you with the ritual in some way. Whenever I do rituals involving any sort of like fire or lighting of candles or putting out of candles, I'm always glad to have other people around just in case. Social rituals can deepen your relationships, and they can have positive side effects for others, even if this ritual is about you and whatever is going on for you. As I mentioned, a lot of the people who participated in my surgery ritual really felt like they gained something from the experience. But even then, the kinds of rituals we experience like on a regular basis, right? If you're graduating from college, people enjoy celebrating that with you and being at your graduation party. If you're getting married, certainly people enjoy, hopefully, being at your wedding, right? So when it comes to explaining what you're doing to others, how much you explain or like how deep you get into like the symbolism of it is totally up to you. You want to consider how participatory it's going to be. So if you're asking folks to do things as part of the ritual, it might help to explain to them like why they're doing that or what it means. You want to consider their attitudes towards ritual or religion. For instance, when I planned out my mastectomy ritual, I really explained like why I was doing it. because I didn't want to just invite folks to like a religious sounding thing without any context, right? But also consider what feels right for you, right? Like, you don't have to go into like all the details of like, oh, well, I've been terrified of surgeries for my whole life and now I'm about to lose my boobs. And right, yeah, there's a little bit of reading between the lines that can happen. So some ideas to make this a little easier. Before the ritual, you can actually like invite folks with like a paper invitation, or if you invite them online, you can write some details like in an event invitation. During the ritual, especially if it's like a more involved one, like what I did, it can be helpful to actually have like a program or handouts that you can give people. And those can also include any sort of extra context about what we're doing that you don't necessarily want to like say out loud. And then after the ritual, it can be good to debrief in some way or to have a space for reflection, like what folks' experiences of it were, what did they get out of it? If you want to know, you can ask like what they would change if it were, you know, if it were them, maybe for next time. But obviously, if this is just about you, you don't have to like take criticism on it whatsoever. Like, you can just do what you want to do. So when it comes to creating roles for your participants, if you want them to participate, you can ask yourself, what does it look like to take part in this ritual, right? Does it look like lighting candles? Does it look like singing a song together? Does it look like offering your own answers to a question or a writing prompt? You can ask yourself, how can your participants assist you? Could they bring supplies? Could they help you pass out items? Could they help you put the fire out or get it started if you're bad at that, right? And finally, what would it mean for others to perform some parts of the ritual? So for my surgery ritual, I had a number of readings, like poems or just little excerpts that were meaningful to me. And I invited some of my friends to read some of those pieces that I thought would resonate with them in particular. So as I said, some examples can be given a reading, carrying out an action together, singing or chanting as a group, or sharing personal stories, memories, etc. So as I mentioned, consent is really important. You want to ensure that your participants like fully understand like what they're taking part in and that they're cool with that. So there are a lot of considerations to think about here. One is kind of what I call the ritual headspace. Like, it can be really emotionally vulnerable, even if you're not the person who's kind of in the spotlight of the ritual. It can be vulnerable. And so you want people to know up front that that can happen and that it can bring up feelings that they didn't expect. So also singing, many of us have pretty unpleasant memories of like compulsory group singing. So if singing in a group is going to be part of a ritual, you want people to know that it's okay not to participate. And if it's not okay not to participate, like you really need everyone to sing, then that's something that folks should know before they like agree to attend. Sharing personal things. If you're going to be sharing any sort of like deep shit of your own, right? You want people to know that that's not compulsory again. And finally, triggers around religious observance. So when I planned my ritual, I made sure that folks knew that there were going to be like Hebrew prayers involved. Because if anyone had any trauma around, again, being forced to participate in organized religion, they could just kind of like, you know, leave themselves out of this particular event. So some scripts that I often use when I facilitate rituals, when I'm inviting folks to participate, is I might say something like, if it calls to you to do so, if it feels right, if you would like to join. When I offer for us to go around in a circle and say something, I always say something like, if you prefer not to speak, please say pass. So this is actually, because I tend to be an over-explainer, when I invited everyone to my mastectomy ritual, on the Facebook event page, I had this whole thing about like what exactly this is gonna do, what kind of mood we're going for, how late can you be, and what specific actions will be involved. When it comes to actions, that's also like accessibility concern. So a lot of folks might find it difficult to like stand up or like stand for a while, do a lot of moving around, right? Maybe they have chronic pain and they're not down for that. So this kind of allows folks to decide for themselves like what they are and aren't comfortable with or able to do. So to my point earlier about what do you say to people who are skeptical about ritual, I kind of got nothing here. Like, I'm not really here to sell you on it. It's something that helped me a lot. I believe that you can be an atheist, a secular person who does weird little things sometimes. If that's not you, that's totally cool. But if you're curious about it, if you think that it can help your mental health, it can help your sense of community, it can bring something to your life, I encourage you to give it a try. So that's about all I had. If you want to get in touch with me, read my writing, here's where you can find me online. And it looks like we have some time for questions. I saw applause, but I didn't hear applause. That's funny.
Oh, funny. Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. We have a question.
Well, this isn't a question per se, but if Heather could post your information to to our meetup page, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I can do that. And I believe this is recorded, so we'll also have it so we can listen to it in the future. But yeah, I'll see what resources Mary may be able to get to us.
Never knowing how close to the microphone. Yeah. So how do you differentiate, or when would you differentiate between a habit and a ritual?
That is a great question. I think that the way that I would differentiate, well, first of all, not every ritual is a habit, right? Like a ritual can be like a one-time thing or a very irregular thing. But this kind of brings me back to my point about intention being the magic sauce, right? The whole point of a habit, and this is why habits are great, is that you can do them kind of mindlessly. If something is a habit, you don't have to really think about it. You don't have to put a lot of thought into it, but you can if you want to, right? You could decide that instead of just having a habit of brushing your teeth every morning, you have a ritual of taking care of your dental hygiene. And you're gonna like do it mindfully, and you're gonna really like reflect and notice how nice it feels for your teeth to feel clean. And you're gonna say a moment of gratitude for modern dentistry, right? Like you can turn a habit into a ritual pretty easily. I guess you can also turn a ritual into a habit. Like, for instance, as I kind of did with my kangaroo example on my desk at work. But yeah, I think that the amount of thought that goes into it is probably the distinction. Good question.
I just realized you have all this get in touch information on there. That's wonderful. So that's how we can learn more about it. But I really liked your example of brushing your teeth. I would never have thought making that ritual, but it could be. That's kind of a really good example of the differences between ritual and habits. Do we have any other questions? Anyone on Zoom have any questions? No more questions? I got a fly in here, that's bugging me. Yeah. All right. Well, I suppose, thank you so much. Another round of applause. Hopefully you can hear this.
Thank you all so much for having me.
Yes, thank you.
I'm so glad you guys are doing like a hybrid, like that's such a cool like accessibility thing. I love it.
Yeah, I think this is gonna be something that we continue into the future, mainly because, I mean, we aren't just Twin Cities atheists, we are Minnesota atheists. We wanna be inclusive of not just people who can make it in person to events in the Twin Cities. So the having a hybrid approach is here to stay, I think. And also we can bring in wonderful speakers such as yourself, that come to us from Ohio, so yeah. But yeah, I think we will have a little bit of more social if anybody wants to stay on Zoom, have any kind of more